Neil, what are some things you like about this roster?
I like its versatility, Jace. I like its youth. You know, we were the youngest team in the playoffs last year. We got even younger after the offseason. So we've got a longer runway with this group. Everybody's under long-term contracts, which was our goal when we re-signed our current players and the free agents we brought in. But I like the fact that we address some needs. You know, I think when we looked at ourselves in the playoffs against elite competition, we definitely needed another ball handler, someone who could make plays. We needed a wing defender. We needed some size and rim protection. And, quite honestly, we needed some more depth. And I think we accomplished that.
Neil, Craig Bernbeck, K2 Sports. You talk about that depth. Now you do have multiple players at multiple positions. And how excited are you to see how the roster ends up and playing time ends up, being dished out, considering how many players you have at certain positions?
I'm really looking forward to it. It's been interesting. For the first 4 years, there was really this clear line. Right? But who the starters were, especially year one, right? That was very clear. The drop off from our starters to our bench was just, was so big. And then, we established a starting lineup when we brought Rolo in, and that was our lineup for a few years. So I think this year there's going to be more competition in camp. There's going to be more competition for playing time. I think guys bring different things to the table. So while we may have redundancies in terms of position, we don't really have redundancies in terms of skill set because the guys all play different styles of basketball. So I think, Terry's just so creative, especially on the offensive end of the floor, that he puts guys in great positions to succeed. And I think we saw that late in the year. Our lineup was in a state of flux, and he was still able to maximize what guys did well and provide a lot of problems for some of the teams we were playing late in the season.
Kerry Eggers, Portland Tribune. Neil, you spent, I think, an unprecedented amount of money to keep the players that you have, plus adding a couple of pieces in the free agency. How will you determine whether you got your value?
Well, I think unprecedented, it's unprecedented for everybody, right? I mean, it's the first time the cap's ever been this high. I think one of the things we look at, Kerry, is it's not the number. I think everybody got sticker shock when they looked at the numbers. We look at things based on percentage of cap. And when you look at the salaries that were given out to our players in order to retain them, based on the percentage of the cap, if you go back to what that would have been 4 or 5 years ago on that cap, these are commensurate salaries. And we think they're actually guys that are going to perform above market value based on the contracts they got. So, look, everybody gets caught up in the money. I don't know why. We've got probably the most aggressive owner in the league, the most supportive owner in the league. He's given resources to this organization for decades. We had success last year, and I think what we realized was it was imperative that we retain our better young players and get them to commit long-term, to our organization. So continued growth, player development, being a factor in the playoffs, I think that's the goal.
You kind of touched on this, Neil, but I think last year at this time, the internal expectations probably outweighed ours in the sitting here. How have those internal expectations shifted after sort of the summer, bringing everybody back?
Look, I don't know if they've shifted. Look, we're still about process, okay? We're still about culture. We're still about chemistry. I do think our guys getting the experience they got during the playoffs last year was invaluable. You have a bunch of young guys, that some of whom hadn't really played significant games at a playoff level, to have that platform that they can build on moving forward is huge. So I think that accelerates everything for us. Terry and I, we've been pretty consistent about not putting numbers or objectives ahead of us. We know that if we follow our process, our culture continues to build, we bring in the right kind of guys under Terry's stewardship, Dame's leadership, the consistency we've had with our core players, we're going to continue to grow. At some point we'll sit this media day and we won't be second guessed for what we did in the offseason, but that may be a few years down the road. So we were more bullish on our roster last year than a lot of other people were, but we wouldn't have signed those guys if we didn't believe in them. So it's the same thing this year. The guys we signed this year, we believe in them. And if we didn't believe they were going to contribute to the roster, we wouldn't have brought them in.
Is there anything that you're curious or intrigued about this roster to see develop?
I don't want to get too much into rotations for Terry, but I think the flexibility that this roster offers, Jace, like I said, we had the luxury of having 5 clearly defined starters. You know, for a couple of years we were really successful, and everybody else knew their role. So I think what I'm most excited about is the ability to provide different solutions on a nightly basis based on matchups, based on style of play that, you know, in the past we really weren't. You know, we put our best group out there, we had teams adjust to us, and, you know, a lot of those nights, you know, we were good enough. But it didn't necessarily mean we had the versatility and the flexibility to make in-game, you know, player personnel adjustments as much as, you know, Terry making tactical adjustments. I think now we have the ability to do both.